The house was quiet, the kind of oppressive silence that weighed heavily on the air. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the glowing screen of my phone, my fingers trembling slightly. The message was still open, the words glaring back at me, sharp and undeniable. "Last night was amazing. Can't wait to see you again." My breath caught in my throat as I read it for the third time, hoping that somehow, in the seconds between, the words might change. They didn't. It wasn't meant for me. It couldn't be. The contact name at the top of the screen, Mark, mocked me with its normalcy. My husband, my partner of 7 years, the man who promised me forever. A chill ran down my spine as I thought back to the past few months. It all began to make sense. The late nights at the office, the sudden need for privacy, the way he'd been pulling away. I'd asked him about it once, carefully, afraid of sounding accusatory. "You've been so distant lately. Is everything okay?" He'd smiled, that disarming, easy smile that I once thought could fix anything. "Just work stress," he'd said, kissing me on the forehead like I was fragile, like I couldn't handle the truth. But now, the truth was in front of me, glaring and undeniable. My chest tightened as I scrolled further up the thread, each message a dagger carving into the foundation of what I thought we had. "You're all I think about. I'll find an excuse to leave early tomorrow." And then, the pictures. I stopped breathing for a moment, as if holding my breath could somehow erase what I'd seen. The realization was suffocating. My Mark. The man who knew all my secrets, the one who held me through sleepless nights and celebrated my every victory, had betrayed me. And worse, he had been doing it for months. The sound of the front door opening jolted me from my thoughts. My heart leaped into my throat, and I quickly locked the phone, tossing it onto the bed as if it had burned me. Mark's voice carried up the stairs, casual and warm, like any other evening. "Hey, babe." I grabbed dinner on the way home. I stood, unsure of what to do. My hands felt cold, my pulse racing in my ears. Could I confront him? Should I? The woman I was a few hours ago would have. She would have stormed downstairs, phone in hand, demanding answers. But now, standing in the shambles of what I thought was my life, I felt paralyzed. When I finally descended the stairs, he was in the kitchen unpacking takeout containers, humming under his breath. It was so ordinary, so maddeningly normal, that for a moment I questioned everything. Was it possible I had misunderstood? Had I been so desperate for an explanation that I jumped to the worst conclusion? But then he turned to me, smiling, and I saw it. Something in his eyes, guilt perhaps, or maybe fear, flashed so briefly I wondered if I'd imagined it. My stomach churned. I couldn't bring myself to sit at the table. "You okay?" he asked, his voice tinged with concern. I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. The dinner was a blur, his words drifting past me as I picked at my food. He was talking about his day, about an upcoming meeting, about plans for the weekend. I nodded at the right moments, forcing a smile here and there, but my mind was miles away, replaying the messages, the photos, the betrayal. Later that night, as he slept beside me, I stared at the ceiling, my mind racing. The rhythmic sound of his breathing only fueled my anger. How could he lie so effortlessly? How could he come home, eat dinner, and sleep peacefully after what he'd done? I wanted to scream. I wanted to shake him awake and demand answers. But instead, I slipped out of bed, careful not to wake him, and made my way to the living room. The cool air bit at my skin, but I didn't care. I needed to think. The pain of his betrayal was like a physical ache, sharp and unrelenting. But beneath the hurt, something else was stirring, a simmering rage, a desire for something more. If he could betray me, why should I hold myself to a higher standard? I thought about the years I had poured into our marriage, the sacrifices I had made, the times I had chosen him over myself. And for what? To be cast aside like I was nothing? The thought made my hands clench into fists. For hours, I sat in the dark, my mind cycling through every memory, every moment that had led me here. By the time the first rays of sunlight crept through the blinds, I had made a decision. If Mark could shatter the vows we made, then I owed him nothing. It was time to reclaim what he had stolen from me, my confidence, my worth, my sense of self. When he woke up that morning, I was already in the kitchen, coffee brewing and an unreadable expression on my face. He kissed me on the cheek, his touch lingering just a moment too long, as if he could sense the shift in me. But I didn't flinch. I didn't cry. And I didn't confront him. Not yet. Instead, I smiled back, a plan forming in my mind. If Mark wanted to play this game, then I was finally ready to stop playing fair. For the first time in months, I felt a spark of something I thought I'd lost: control. The club was alive with sound, the bass from the speakers reverberating through my chest as the flashing lights painted the room in shades of red and gold. It wasn't the kind of place I'd usually go to, not my scene, not my crowd. But tonight, I needed an escape, something to drown out the thoughts that had been clawing at me since that morning. If the universe was cruel enough to shatter my marriage, the least I could do was steal a night for myself. I perched on a bar stool, nursing a drink I barely tasted, my eyes scanning the room. Couples swayed on the dance floor, lost in their own rhythm. Groups of friends laughed, the kind of carefree joy I could barely remember feeling. And then there were the men, the ones who prowled the edges of the room, confident and predatory, their gazes lingering too long on women who didn't meet their eyes. I wasn't sure what I was looking for. Maybe validation, maybe a distraction, or maybe I wasn't looking for anything at all, just waiting for something to find me. And then it did. He appeared at the bar beside me, a tall man with dark eyes that seemed to drink in everything around him. His presence was magnetic, his confidence easy but not overbearing. "Rough night?" he asked, his voice deep, smooth, like the kind of music you play in the background of a good memory. I glanced at him, surprised by the casual warmth in his tone. "You could say that." He smiled, and for a moment, the noise of the club seemed to fade. "Well, whatever it is, I doubt it's worth drowning in that drink." A small laugh escaped me unbidden. "And what do you suggest?" Before he could answer, another man approached, a stark contrast to the first. He was leaner, his energy sharper, with an intensity in his eyes that made it hard to look away. He nodded at the first man before turning to me. "Looks like I arrived just in time," he said, his grin playful but edged with challenge. "Mind if I join?" It was surreal, being the center of their attention. Two strangers, each compelling in their own way, each vying for my interest without even knowing my name. I didn't recognize the woman I was becoming in that moment, the one who leaned into their banter, who smiled without thinking, who let herself be seen. The conversation flowed effortlessly, their chemistry with me as natural as their banter with each other. I learned their names, Dylan and Marcus, but little else. It wasn't about the details. It was about the escape, the fleeting moment where I wasn't a betrayed wife sitting at home, scrolling through evidence of her husband's infidelity. Here, I was someone else entirely. Dylan, the first man, exuded an understated charm, his words thoughtful and deliberate. He leaned in close when he spoke, as if each word was meant only for me. Marcus, on the other hand, was bold and unapologetic, his laughter loud enough to turn heads. Together, they were like fire and ice, each amplifying the other in a way that was intoxicating. Somewhere between the second drink and the third, Dylan extended a hand. "Dance with me?" I hesitated for a moment, the weight of my wedding ring pressing against my skin. But then I thought of Mark, of the messages, of the lies. And in that moment, I let myself forget. The dance floor was electric, the air heavy with heat and adrenaline. Dylan's hands rested lightly on my waist as we moved, his touch firm but respectful. His eyes never left mine, as though the chaos of the room didn't exist. It wasn't long before Marcus joined us, his presence commanding. He took my hand, spinning me effortlessly before pulling me close. The three of us moved in unison, their energy enveloping me, their attention intoxicating. I felt seen in a way I hadn't in years, like I was the center of their universe, if only for a night. As the hours slipped by, the weight I'd been carrying began to lighten. The anger, the betrayal, the questions that had plagued me, they all faded into the background. All that mattered was the here and now, the feeling of being alive, of being wanted. When we finally stepped off the dance floor, breathless and laughing, Dylan handed me a glass of water. "You're full of surprises," he said, his eyes sparkling. I shrugged, a playful smile tugging at my lips. "Maybe you just don't know me well enough yet." Marcus leaned against the bar, watching me with an intensity that made my skin prickle. "And whose fault is that?" he teased. It was a game, a dangerous one, but for the first time in a long time, I didn't care. I let myself get lost in it, in the freedom of the moment. As the night wore on, the club began to empty, the music softening to a low hum. Dylan and Marcus exchanged a look, something unspoken passing between them, before Dylan turned to me. "It's late. Let us walk you out." I hesitated, the reality of the situation crashing down on me. This was the edge of the cliff, the point of no return. My heart raced as I weighed my options, my mind a whirlwind of emotions. But then I thought of Mark, of the way he looked at me that morning, so sure of his control, so certain I'd never stray. And in that moment, I made my decision. I nodded, my voice steady. "Let's go." The cool night air hit me as we stepped outside, the city alive with its own rhythm. Dylan walked on one side of me, Marcus on the other, their presence grounding and exhilarating all at once. I didn't know where the night would take me, or what it would mean when the sun rose. But for the first time in months, I felt like I was writing my own story, and I wasn't ready for it to end just yet. The sunlight crept through the blinds, pale and uninvited, stirring me from a sleep that felt more like a haze than rest. My eyes fluttered open, the sharp edges of reality slicing through the brief comfort of unconsciousness. The room was unfamiliar, its muted tones and minimalist decor a stark contrast to the chaos swirling in my mind. I sat up slowly, the events of the night before rushing back with dizzying clarity. Dylan's easy laughter, Marcus's smoldering gaze. The way their presence had made me feel like someone else entirely, someone unbound by the weight of betrayal and heartbreak. I ran a hand through my hair, disheveled and tangled, as I tried to piece together how I had ended up here, in this unfamiliar bed, in the aftermath of choices I never imagined making. The door creaked open and Dylan appeared, holding 2 cups of coffee. He smiled, his expression soft and unassuming, as if this morning were the most natural thing in the world. "Morning," he said, setting 1 cup on the nightstand. "Thought you might need this." I nodded, murmuring a quiet thanks as I took the cup, the warmth of it grounding me. Marcus followed moments later, leaning casually against the doorway, his sharp features softened by the morning light. "You disappeared on us for a minute," he said, his voice teasing but not unkind. The room felt smaller with both of them in it, their presence as commanding as it had been the night before. I sipped the coffee, its bitterness a jolt to my system, and avoided their eyes. I didn't know what to say, didn't know how to bridge the chasm between the woman I was last night and the woman I had woken up as. "Regrets?" Dylan asked, his tone careful, measured. I looked up, startled by the question. "I don't know," I admitted honestly. The truth felt heavy on my tongue, but I couldn't bring myself to lie. Not to them and not to myself. Marcus pushed off the doorway, his gaze unwavering. "You don't strike me as someone who does things they regret," he said, his words a challenge and a reassurance all at once. I didn't know how to respond to that. Last night had been impulsive, reckless even, but it had also been freeing in a way I couldn't fully articulate. For the first time in months, I had felt alive, unburdened by the weight of Mark's betrayal. But now, in the light of day, the reality of what I had done loomed over me, impossible to ignore. As if sensing my turmoil, Dylan reached out, his hand brushing mine. "We're not here to complicate your life," he said gently. "Last night was unexpected, but it doesn't have to mean anything more than what it was." His words were kind, but they didn't erase the knot in my chest. "What if it does?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "What if it changes everything?" Marcus sat on the edge of the bed, his expression unreadable. "Maybe that's not a bad thing," he said simply. The weight of his words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. I thought about Mark, about the years we had spent building a life together, about the promises we had made and the lies that had unraveled them. I thought about the woman I had been before him, confident, self-assured, unafraid to take risks. Somewhere along the way, I had lost her, buried her beneath the roles of wife and partner, forgetting that I was more than just an extension of him. Dylan and Marcus had reminded me of that, if only for a night. They had seen me, not as a victim or a betrayed wife, but as a woman, strong, desirable, and unapologetically herself. I stood, the blanket slipping from my shoulders as I moved to the window. The city stretched out before me, alive and unrelenting, its rhythm a stark contrast to the quiet chaos within me. I didn't know what came next, but I knew I couldn't go back to the life I had been living, not without acknowledging how much I had changed. "I should go," I said finally, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. Neither of them tried to stop me. Dylan nodded, his expression understanding, while Marcus simply watched, his intensity softened by something that looked almost like respect. "Take care of yourself," Dylan said as I gathered my things, his tone warm and sincere. "And don't let anyone dim that fire," Marcus added, a small, crooked smile playing on his lips. Their words lingered with me as I stepped out into the crisp morning air, the world bustling around me as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. When I returned home, the house felt colder, emptier, despite the familiarity of its walls. Mark was in the kitchen, scrolling through his phone, oblivious to the storm that had swept through my life in the past 24 hours. He looked up when I walked in, his expression shifting from surprise to curiosity. "You're up early," he said casually, as if we hadn't been drifting further apart with each passing day. I didn't respond immediately, my eyes locking on his as I tried to find the words. The confrontation I had avoided before was now inevitable. I thought about the messages I had found, the lies he had told, the promises he had broken. And then I thought about Dylan and Marcus, about the way they had reminded me of who I was, of what I deserved. "I need to talk to you," I said, my voice steady, unyielding. Mark's brows furrowed, a flicker of unease crossing his face. "What's going on?" I took a deep breath, the weight of my decision settling over me. "Everything," I said simply, and as I stood there, staring at the man I had once thought I'd spend forever with, I realized that this was just the beginning. Whatever came next, it would be on my terms. For the first time in a long time, I felt ready to face it.